Despite Thrawn being one of the most iconic characters in Star Wars history, his original faction, or society, or civilization, or whatever you want to call it, the Chiss Ascendancy, was a bit of a mystery for a long time in Star Wars legends. But one of the things we do know about them gives them a pretty dark fate. In order to understand why that happens, though, we also get to talk a lot about weird, inconsistent name lore and retcons. The Chiss Ascendancy was mentioned a few times throughout the New Jedi Order, including a direct appearance in Force Heretic Refugee, when Luke Skywalker visits them while on the hunt for the living planet Zonama Seacot, which he believed was the secret key to ending the Yuuzhan Vong War. But the biggest roles for the faction, at least in book form, came in Timothy Zahn's Survivor's Quest and Outbound Flight, as well as Troy Denning's Dark Nest trilogy. In the new Disney canon, Zahn wrote a full trilogy about Thrawn's early days in the Chiss Ascendancy, which, while having some discrepancies from the Legends version, is the biggest look we do get into the faction anywhere. In both continuities, though we're going to be focusing on Legends, the Chiss government is organized around an aristocracy composed of a certain number of ruling families. This certain number isn't all that certain, as it varies from period to period as families gain and lose prominence, something which ties into the dark period we're going to be discussing. But these families aren't based purely on blood ties. Sometimes individuals showing a high level of promise in some field would get adopted into one of the ruling families, which most commonly happened with individuals entering the Expansionary Defense Fleet, the branch of the Chiss Ascendancy's military organized around the defense of the Ascendancy from external threats, or at least operating outside of core Chiss territory. Every member of the CEDF became a merit adoptive of one of the ruling families. Once flag ranks were achieved in the CEDF, though, family names are then also stripped off, whether the individual was a merit adoptive or a blood relative, something we see with Admiral Ar'alani. We don't know her original name in Legends, but in canon she originally held the name Aritzi Ar'alani, as a member of the Aritzi ruling family. We have some open slots of unnamed ruling families in Legends, so we could also just assume that's the name he would have wanted to give her in Outbound Flight, but you can't really pull in all of Zahn's canon ruling families, since only 2 of the 9 match up with the ones we have in Legends, even from his own work. But anyways, for most of the modern period of the Star Wars galaxy, from at least 27 BBY in Outbound Flight to Survivor's Quest around 22 BBY, the number of ruling families remained at 9. Assuming they were the same families throughout this period, these most likely included the Myth family, Naruto, Chapla, Chaff, Inrakini, Sabozin, and 3 others. And this, even within Legends, is where we get into some discrepancies. Zahn's bit of lore about the merit adoptives in the CEDF, and his creation of about half of the ruling families, came after other authors had already named certain ruling families in earlier works, like 2001 Star Wars Gamer article, which put the Naruto, Chapla, Inrakini, and Sabozin families in place as the only 4 ruling families of the time. These earlier articles and books tended to treat the last part of the name as the family name, i.e. the Naruto part of Thrawn's name made him part of the Naruto family, and we see this with some other characters introduced in this earlier period like Hesserolia Naruto. When Zahn started setting up his version of the Chiss, the Naruto family wasn't the ruling family Thrawn was a part of, it was instead the Myth part of his name. So he introduced the Myth as one of the ruling families, and he established the fact that the family name was actually the first part of their name. Most Chiss would generally be referred to by something called a core name, which takes the middle part of their name, and then generally, but not always, some of the letters on the other sides of the apostrophes that divide up parts of their names to create a separate name. So Mythra Naruto becomes Thrawn, his brother Mithras Saphis becomes Thras. But getting back to who the ruling families are, given Outbound Flight's claim that every CEDF member with a full name was a merit adoptive of a ruling family, then we can also extrapolate 2 other possible ruling family names from other characters in Outbound Flight and Survivor's Quest. We have the Brast family from Brast Talshi Barku, the captain of a vessel in Survivor's Quest, and then Yal from Lavik, whose full name is Yal Avik Kima, chief engineering officer on the Springhawk, which is Thrawn's flagship in Outbound Flight. So that leaves us with 1 to 3 unnamed ruling families of the 9 we know exist during Outbound Flight and Survivor's Quest, depending on whether you want to accept the extrapolation for Yal and Brast. But when ruling families were first introduced, they were introduced as the 4 ruling families like I mentioned in the Star Wars Gamer article, not 9. And the intent in Force Heretic Refugee and the Star Wars Gamer article seemed to be that the 4 ruling families were a permanent fixture, not part of an ebb and flow of families over time. According to the Star Wars Gamer article, quote, "The four ruling families, the Chapla, Naruto, Inrakini, and Sabozin, represented bloodlines said to predate modern Chiss civilization. Every Chiss claims affiliation to one of the four families, as determined by tradition and birthplace. In truth, the family names are little more than cultural holdovers," end quote. Each family was then also given specific responsibilities, also referenced in Refugee, although typically dropped in later explanations of the families. Quote, "Chapla handles issues of colonial affairs, resource distribution, and agriculture. Naruto handles the military and foreign affairs. Inrakini handles industry, science, and communication. Sabozin handles justice, health, and education," end quote. So this is a far more entrenched system, with the families acting more as departments than actual families, which is more like how they are in Zahn's later works. In Refugee, Jason Solo also calls it fairly common knowledge that the Chiss were governed by these four families with these distinct responsibilities. That happens in 28 ABY. Whereas in Survivor's Quest by Timothy Zahn, set 6 years earlier, Luke and Mara learn about the 9 ruling families, but they weirdly do it without liking this video and subscribing for more. So there was a definite discrepancy there, and this discrepancy became the basis for some pretty dark things to happen to the Chiss. The idea of the family number being common knowledge gets tossed to the wayside, and in the Dark Nest trilogy, Luke references 5 ruling families mysteriously disappearing, though this fits perfectly well with what Zahn says about the family numbers changing over time when he established his other ones later on. So now in the Dark Nest crisis in 35 ABY, we still only have the 4 ruling families from the older sources. So just to reiterate the timeline a little bit, we have Zahn's work Outbound Flight and Survivor's Quest, which were set in 27 BBY and 22 ABY, despite being written in 2005-2006. Then in 28 ABY, we have Refugee, which was actually written in 2003, along with the Star Wars Gamer University of Sanbra article about the Chiss, which kind of places its timeline around the same point and was released in 2001. This one also says that nobody knew what a Chiss was before Thrawn came in. And subsequent lore would also put in a lot more ties between the Chiss Ascendancy and the rest of the galaxy, so they weren't quite the same mystery at that point either. So the stuff that comes up in Dark Nest tries to explain how they went from 9 ruling families down to those 4 from the older sources. And it's actually one of the members from one of the disappeared families, Chaff Formbentrano or Formby from the Chaff family, who answers the mystery for them. Luke and Mara's meeting with the Chiss and learning about the 9 ruling families came as a result of the Chiss using a pretext to start a war. Chiss doctrine forbade them from being the aggressors in a war, requiring them to be attacked first before they could engage. This was one of the core tenets of Chiss society, essentially. Thrawn skirting around this is one of the reasons that contributes to his exile from the Chiss. One of the other species in the area, the Vagari, were thought to be getting too powerful by the Chiss, and they'd also been one of Thrawn's earlier concerns. They were a nomadic species who were essentially the bullies of that part of the unknown regions. So hoping to lure the Vagari into an attack, the Chiss invited Luke and Mara to reclaim the wreckage of an old Jedi project, the Outbound Flight. The Vagari did attack during this reclamation mission, as the Chiss had hoped, giving them a reason to declare war. This war, known as the Third Vagari War, proved more costly than the Chiss anticipated, causing a labor shortage within the Ascendancy. Luckily, another Chiss neighbor proved to be the answer to this issue, an insectoid species called the Kilicks. These traditionally peaceful bugs proceeded to be a great source of replacement labor for the Chiss, with one major downside. They operated under a hive mind, but this hive mind could extend to anyone who spent too much time with them, taking them into the nest and subsuming them within the hive mind as what was called a joiner, removing most sense of individual identity. The Chiss ruling families knew about this and took some precautions, but these were, according to Formby, sabotaged, and soon, 2 of the 9 families had entirely become joiners, so that's almost 20% of the entire government of the Chiss, which became entirely bug mind pals. 3 of the other 7 families became very heavily reliant on the Kilick labor force, while the remaining 4 took issue with the continued use of it, wrestling in what Formby denies is a civil war, but it seems to have pretty clearly been something of a civil war. The Chaff family no longer being a ruling family, but Formby still being an aristocrat, one of the leading political figures in the Ascendancy, implies to me that his family was probably one of the 3 who relied too heavily on the insect labor, rather than one of the ones fully absorbed into the nest, while the remaining 4 were presumably the Naruto, Inrakini, Sabozin, and Chapla. The Grand Ascendancy trilogy introduced the idea of essentially junior partners called great families, with ruling families rotating in and out of that grouping over time. So it's possible the Chaff family fits into something like this category after this period, even if it doesn't explicitly exist in legends. Realistically, Formby himself was probably just used by the authors because he was a known character, but with the pre-existing list of families we know were still around, it can make it a little harder to reconcile his remaining place of prominence. The period after this family cull got even darker for the Chiss. The reverberations of this definitely not a civil war still saw attempts on the remaining Chiss officials' lives, like that of Baron Soontir Fel by at least 28 ABY in Refugee. He was being targeted by members of one of the disgraced families. And all of this was followed up by a pretty massive war between the Chiss and the Kilicks, as the Kilicks became a massively expansionist force under the leadership of Raynar Thul, Lomi Plo, and Welk, Force users who had been incorporated into the hive mind, imparting them with more care for the individual lives of each Kilick in the case of Raynar Thul, and some nefarious goals in the case of Lomi Plo and Welk, who had been Darkside Force users. What was left of the Ascendancy did manage to survive this war, and was still intact in some form by the Legacy comics 100 years later, but this seems undeniably like one of the darkest parts of Chiss history. That's going to do it for today. Thank you for watching. If you're interested in seeing something else covered on the channel, let me know in the comments. Remember to leave a like and subscribe for more if you have enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.